Hello everyone and welcome to the next lecture of the Silk Road Chapters project. This is the lecture number 10 and it finishes our cycle which we devoted to the general history of Central Asia. And in this lecture we'll explore how this region, these three khanates, transitioned into being the part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. This period is quite controversial in local history, but of course it's undeniable that it's really had a big impact on the local art, culture and trade. So let's dive deeper into this transformation. This was a time when the idea of empire building was spreading all around the globe. France in North Africa or British India or America expanding into Pacific were all happening at the same time. So of course Central Asia, located between the two great powers, became the vital zone of interest. Ties with Russia started back into the 16th century. It was a time of the great geographical discoveries and the Great Silk Road declined, which was a very big problem for the Central Asia as it had no access to the sea. Meanwhile, the Russian principalities were on their rise because they just thrown down the Mongol yoke and were looking for the trading opportunities. This was a win-win situation for both lands, and that's how the trading routes started to shift into Russian lands. Since the 16th century, Russia became one of the key partners in trade for Central Asia. The Volga trading route, which was going through Astrakhan and Kazan, became the major trading route for Central Asian merchants since the 1600s. Russian Tsars allowed Central Asian traders to settle in certain districts of Moscow and Kazan. Tatar intermediaries played a key role as translators and diplomats. As we discussed in our previous lecture, Central Asia was divided into three big khanates: Khiva, Bukhara and Kokand. They very often clashed over the territories or trading routes or resources. And also there were nomadic people who didn't consider themselves to be a part of any khanate. They roamed freely, raiding the caravans and enslaving people. In Kazakhstan, for example, there were semi-independent state formations which were called zhuzes. While not political fragmentation in a strict sense, Central Asia in the 19th century it was like a patchwork of different powers, and each of the powers was pursuing their own interest. Each khanate had its own currency, legal system, and also the complex relations with the tribal leaders and religious figures. For example, in the Fergana Valley there were like dozens of different tribal alliances who were quite autonomous, even though technically they were under Kokand rule. In the steppes, Kazakh Khan were very often reveling with the Russian-backed figures competing with those who were loyal to China or Emir of Bukhara. All of this made the resistance against the powers from outside very difficult. By the late 18th and 19th century, Central Asia experienced a kind of the cultural downturn, because before there were the times of Sufism with its relatively free thinking, of course with the Islamic limits, and a lot of the rulers, they patronized science, architecture and literature. Some of them even themselves wrote poems or created scientific works. For example, Khiva's ruler Abulgazi Khan was a historian, and the ruler of Bukhara, Ubaydullah Khan, wrote poetry in several languages. By the end of 18th century, the free-seeking faded and the religious conservative rose, which was limiting the cultural development. For example, the education in the madrasas was only focusing on memorizing the classical texts, and innovations in medicine, astronomy, they also slowed. While some urban elites, they still maintained libraries and manuscript copying, but there was a little investment in the modern printing and secular education. At the same time, a lot of the groups welcomed Russian knowledges, especially the merchants who wanted the access to the modern navigation, accounting or business practices. This shift made the invasion of the Russia much easier. Russia made the early moves towards Central Asia in the beginning of 18th century with the expedition of Bykovich-Cherkassky in 1717 to the Khiva Khanate. The whole expedition was killed there. Peter I, who was the emperor at that time, he wanted the revenge, but he was too busy with his war against Sweden. The real annexation process began in 1730s when the part of Kazakhstan who were tired of the fighting with Dzungars themselves asked to become the part of Russian Empire, and this was the first move of the Russians into the region. Russian Empire used diplomacy, marriage alliances and the promises of their protection to get the influence over Kazakh leaders. The junior Jews accepted formally the Russian protection in 1731, but actually it was quite a slow process because because a lot of the tribal leaders, they were protesting against these contacts for over a century. Because of that, Russia started the construction of the forts along the border, not for military purposes, but also to monitor and intimidate the tribal leaders. In the 19th century, Russia intensified its invasion. Beyond their territorial ambitions, the main driver was the Great Game, the strategic rivalry with the British Empire. It was pretty much the same as the Cold War in the 20th century between USSR and US. It was a shadow war between British Empire and Russian Empire in the 19th century. Both of these countries were sending their envoys, some of them openly and others undercover. Russia was coming from the north, while the Brits were coming from the south through India, Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was only a matter of time when the passes collide in Central Asia. Agents like Alexander Burns from British Empire or Russian Nikolai Ignatiev disguised themselves as merchants, mystics or diplomats. Their missions very often were mapping, making contacts and also accessing the local politics. The famous fear of British people that Russia can get access to the Khyber Pass and threaten India was sparkling in London. And also Russia in their turn exaggerated the threat that British agents could incite the rebellion in Central Asia. There were other motivations too. Khiva held thousands of Russian slaves, which Russia asked to release many times, but with no success. Also, during the civil war in US, Russia started to face the shortages of cotton, as US was the main supplier of cotton for Europe. But Central Asia, with its developed agriculture, was a perfect place to grow cotton. Officially, the Russian government didn't encourage the conquest because Russian Empire was already huge, stretching up to Alaska. But the self-driven generals always went unpunished for taking the new lands because for them, Central Asia was a perfect place to shine. Kazakhstan was fully annexed by 1830s, 1840s, and Russia moved closer to Tashkent, which at that time was a part of Kokand Khanate. And Tashkent was a really big city with around 100,000 people living here, and of course it was an important hub for the trading. And even though Tashkent was separated from Kokand Khanate with the mountains, but Kokand Khans, they were putting a great effort to keep the control over it. By the 1860s, Kokand Khanate faced an economical decline plus public dissatisfaction, especially in Tashkent. The pro-Russian sentiment was growing, especially among merchants and artisans. But some of them were seeking for Russian support and some of them looked to Bukhara. Tashkent's bazaar were full of goods from China, Persia and India. The city was big. There were more than 30 caravansarais, like 100 mosques and multiple guilds. The elite often competed for the control, which of course created another political instability, and some of Russian merchants already constructed small communities in Tashkent even before their annexation, and their presence in the city really helped Russians to better understand the inner situation. In the beginning of 1860s, Russia started to make the more active moves for the conquest of Central Asia. For example, Colonel Chernyaev, he led a small squad to conquer the city. And the rumors also were spreading that Emir of Bukhara, he was about to come and capture the city, which provoked Chernyaev to move more actively. Though the city was well fortified and many opposed Russians, especially the clergy, the decisive battle between Russians and Kokand Emirate finished with the victory of Russians in 1865. Chernyaev had around 2,000 people, while the city was protected by around 25,000 troops. And even though the locals outnumbered Chernyaev, but Chernyaev had better artillery and organization. He also used psychological tactics. For example, he was spreading rules that the local elites, they already surrendered, which of course caused panic. Chernyaev wanted to present himself more as liberator than a conqueror. For example, he allowed to continue praying in mosques, he kept the Institute of Qazi, Islamic judges, and also he prohibited the looting. Russia then moved towards Samarkand, which was a part of Bukhara Emirate, and conquered it in 1868. Then Khiva, it fell in 1873 and Kokand in 1876. And the Russian extended as far as the borders with the Western China, which really alarmed the dynasty of Qin. But peace was secured through the treaty in 1881. And then in the 1880s, Turkmenistan was also annexed to the territories of Russian Empire. The capture of Samarkand was really a symbolic moment because previously it was the heart of the dynasty of Timurids, and also it was a big cultural hub and one of the centers of Islam. So conquering it represented not only strategic control, but also it was a kind of very prestigious thing. Russian forces took Samarkand after the series of battles with Bukhara Emirate, and further it became the base for the more administrative and military activity. And Samarkand was later incorporated into Russian Empire by connecting it with the rail and telegraph. Khiva, meanwhile, for a very long time was seen as a frontier outpost because it was isolated deep in the desert. And the General Kaufmann's campaign in the 1873 faced a lot of difficulties, hard terrain, shortage of water supply, and everything of that made the march really difficult. Despite this, Russian army reached Khiva and talked it into the submission, and Khiva became the protectorate. While keeping the internal control, it gave it foreign politics and economic life to Russia. The Kokand Khanate was annexed during the internal unrest. Different fractions inside Kokand were fighting for the power, and after the rebellion in 1875, Russia managed to annex the Kokand Khanate as well. While some Kokandis welcomed them as stabilizing force, another resisted fiercely. But in 1876, Kokand Khanate was abolished and it was absorbed into Turkestan Governor-Generalship. The annexation of Turkmenistan, on the contrary, was a longer process because Turkmenistan tribe, especially Tekke, they were fighting back with determination. And finally, at the siege of Geok-Tepe, which was one of the bloodiest pages in the campaign of Russia here in Central Asia, Turkmenistan also was annexed to the territories of Russian Empire. This alarms the Qin dynasty in western China because Russia was coming closer and closer in the borders, and so Qin dynasty was really afraid of the influence of Russia, which was growing here. The Treaty of St. Petersburg, which was signed in 1881, settled the borders between China and Russia, avoiding the further escalation. All 5 Central Asia stands became the part of Russia. Khiva and Bukhara became protectorate. On the other territory was formed Turkestan Governor-Generalship with Tashkent as its capital. The Turkestan Governor-Generalship was established in 1867 and it consisted of several administrative regions. It was governed by the military officials, which was directly appointed from St. Petersburg. But though it was called the governorate, but it actually functioned differently from the European parts of the state because the laws were adapted to the local realities. Tashkent, chosen as a capital, grew rapidly in importance. It became the main center of administrative, economical, and military control for the entire regions. New neighborhoods for the Russian settlers were constructed with churches, barracks, and European-style homes, while the local population kept on their traditional lifestyle. This dual structure became a defining feature of Russian colonial cities in Central Asia. Even though Samarkand became the part of Governor-Generalship, but Bukhara and Khiva became the protectorates. The Russians, they controlled the foreign policy and trade, while the local customs and traditions remained the same. Russian authorities preserved Sharia courts for sedentary populations and also adat, customary law for nomadic people. This legal pluralism allowed the Russian administration to maintain the local life without disrupting it too abruptly. In fact, the Russian officials very often relied on the local judges and tribal elders to administer justice, and Sharia courts, they kept on functioning in many cities and villages, and their decisions were generally respected. In Bukhara, Emir kept the right to mint the coins, lead the prayers, and appoint the judges and scholars. In Khiva, they also were trying to perform different kind of administrative reforms, very often encouraged by Russians or with their assistance. Annexation brought the massive infrastructural changes, especially the construction of the railways. Built by the Russian soldiers under the harsh conditions, these railways operate till today. And these railways, they connected Central Asia to Russia's industrial center, incorporating them into the economic life of the empire. Trade volumes increased. The Trans-Caspian Railway, which was constructed in the 1880s, firstly for military reasons, but very quickly it became one of the main commercial arteries. In 1888, 1898 it reached Samarkand and then further to Fergana Valley and Ashgabat. The rail stations became the center of the life, with the bazaars and granaries not far away from them. This connection to the railways it boosted the export of cotton, wool and raw materials. Railways also helped to centralize the imperial control because the soldiers could be moved quickly in response to the rebellions and revolts. At the same time, the travel became easier for merchants and travelings, facilitating not only commerce but also provoking the cultural exchange between Central Asia and Russia. Of course, irrigation canals were constructed, and previously barren lands, for example, Steppe between Tashkent and Samarkand, became the farmland. Cotton production surged, replacing the import from United States, and also the Russian settlers introduced the new crops to the locals like rye, oats, beets, cabbage, tomatoes, and the other things. Locals adopted haymaking and improved their livestock practices, and they also appeared the division of the labor. Like the locals, they were occupied with cotton production, livestock and crafts, and the Russians, they dealt with vegetables and grain. Major irrigation projects like Dukhovsky Canal in Zarafshan Valley helped to transform the barren lands into the farmlands. And while the Russians, they oversaw their constructions, the locals were providing them man labor. Even though some irrigation canals were constructed with forced labor, like with convicts or prisoners of war, the locals also welcomed the changes because they were hoping for improved harvests. Many also saw the increasing in productivity, and some of them even started to use the tools and techniques which were introduced by Russian agronomists. Doctors, engineers, land surveyors, agronomists, veterinarians started to come here, the professions which were not known in this land till that times. In the early 20th century, the Prime Minister of Khiva, Islam Haja, he constructed a hospital where he invited the male doctors and also female doctors, and that's how local women finally got access to the health care. The Russian merchants and industrialists constructed here stores, factories and even the cinemas. In Tashkent and Samarkand, new medical clinics treated everything from infectious diseases to eye conditions, and also the population were taught the basic hygiene, and the smallpox vaccination was introduced to this region. Veterinary services helped to improve the health of the livestock, which was of course crucial for nomadic people. Educational reforms also slowly started to take root, and technical schools for irrigation and agriculture started to be opened in the beginning of 19th century. And even though these institutions, they were mostly for the children of the Russian settlers, but the local elite also started to send their children to that schools. Cultural exchange blossomed. It was the time when the people from Central Asia started to travel to Moscow, St. Petersburg, or even to Europe. And the European and Russian styles, dishes, furniture, they became very popular. And actually that was a time when the black and green tea actually came to Central Asia, replacing the local herbal fusions. Yes, even though tea now is considered to be the main drink of Central Asia, but the real tea came here only in the second half of 19th century. Intellectuals and merchants from Bukhara, Samarkand and Tashkent started visiting the Russian bookshops and cafes. Some of them even learned the Russian language, and they read the Russian in European literature in translation. This exposure to the new ideas like liberalism, socialism and secularism later inspires the local reform thinkings all across the region. Meanwhile, of course, Russians adopted some of the local customs as well. For example, such food as pilav, samsa or kurut became very frequent in the Russian homes. Local elites, they also hired the Russian architect to construct their houses and palaces for them. That's how the local so-called Turkestan style emerged, when was the mix with the European standards of the construction and the local yellow brick. And in many places like in Tashkent, Bukhara and Samarkand, we still can see a lot of the buildings constructed in that era. In the early 20th century, the Jadids movement called for the reform, like secular schools, reform in politics, local language newspapers, and also movement towards the democracy. This movement was very active in the beginning of 20th century, but then was gradually suppressed by Bolsheviks after their revolution in 1917. Jadids, they were not anti-Russian by default. In fact, a lot of them admired Russian science and progress, but what they wanted to modernize their own societies while preserving the local identity. Reformers like Khaja Mahmud Behbudi or Ismail Gasprinsky opened dozens of new-style schools and also published newspapers like Taraki, which means progress. And the topics there ranged from women's rights to the economical modernization. In some areas, Russian officials, they even quietly supported the movement of Jadids because they want to weaken the local religious elites. But after the Great October Revolution in 1917, Bolsheviks saw Jadids as a threat. And that's how in the first years of Soviet Republic, a lot of them were arrested and executed. Of course, not everything went smooth because a lot of the locals opposed the Russian presence here. Or, for example, after the abolition of serfdom in Russia, many Russian peasants, they started to move to Central Asia, causing tension. And of course, there were some famous rebels, like, for example, Cholera riot in Tashkent in 1892, or the 1916 uprising against the conscription to the First World War labor. The Basmachi movement in 1920s and 1930s also resisted the Russian rule, but that's a topic for another lecture. There are different opinions about Russia's annexation of Central Asia, but it undeniably shaped the region. The 19th and the early 20th century laid the groundwork for Central Asia as we know it today. And understanding this period of history is crucial for the understanding of the history, culture, and economy of this region. From railways to schools, from hospital to architecture, a lot of that institutions have the roots in that era. A Russian period also left behind the multilingual environment, strong technical education, and the legacy of both reform and resistance. It's a layered history, not only about the annexation, but also about the coexistence, adaptation, and long-term transformation. If you like this lecture, please comment, share, and like. And of course, follow us so you won't miss any of our other lectures.